There's a very specific, very predictable shift that happens the moment someone realizes they can no longer control you. It doesn't look like giving up. It doesn't look like respect for your boundary, even though that's exactly what should happen. Instead, something else kicks in. Something almost every person who's ever set a real boundary with a controlling person has experienced, but almost nobody has actually named clearly. Today we're naming it, because once you see this pattern for what it is, you'll never mistake it for anything else again. Here's the core idea we're building this entire episode around. Control isn't actually a single tactic, it's a goal. And when one method of achieving that goal stops working, a controlling person doesn't simply accept the loss and walk away peacefully. They switch strategies almost automatically, moving toward whatever remaining lever still seems available to them. Understanding this, that control is the destination, and the specific tactic is just the current vehicle, explains almost every confusing, frustrating experience people have after finally setting a boundary that actually holds. Let's walk through what this shift actually looks like, tactic by tactic, because it rarely announces itself as, "Now I will try something different." It just quietly happens, and recognizing it in real time is what protects you from getting pulled back into the exact dynamic you just worked so hard to escape. The first shift: when direct confrontation stops working, they move to guilt. This is often the very first pivot, because guilt is one of the most efficient tools available to someone who's used to getting their way through pressure. If you've just held a boundary, said no to something, refused to engage in an argument, stopped responding to provocation, expect very soon after some version of, "I can't believe you do this to me," or "after everything I've done for you," or a heavy, performed sadness specifically calibrated to make you feel responsible for their emotional state. This isn't really about their feelings, even though it's dressed up entirely in the language of feelings. It's a lever, deployed the instant the previous lever, direct control, stopped generating results. The key insight here is that guilt, in this specific context, isn't actually about you having done something wrong. It's a diagnostic tool for you to notice. Someone just realized their usual method stopped working, and they're testing whether guilt can reopen the door that boundary just closed. Recognizing it as a strategy, rather than as genuine, deserved remorse on your part, changes your entire relationship to the discomfort it produces. The second shift: when guilt doesn't work either, they escalate to reframing you as the problem. This is one of the more disorienting pivots, because it happens with total conviction, delivered as though it's simply obvious fact, rather than a strategic reframe. Suddenly, you're too sensitive, impossible to please, always making everything difficult. The boundary you set, often something completely reasonable, sometimes even something small, gets recast as evidence of a character flaw in you, rather than evidence of a person finally protecting themselves appropriately. This tactic works when it works, because it exploits something almost universal. Nobody wants to actually be the unreasonable one. And a controlling person, sensing that guilt alone isn't enough, will often escalate to attacking your character specifically, because if they can get you doubting whether your boundary was fair in the first place, they've reopened a door that seemed closed just moments earlier. The tell here is specificity, or rather, the lack of it, vague, sweeping character accusations. "You're just like this. You always do this," rather than a specific, honest engagement with the actual thing you said or did. Genuine feedback tends to be concrete. Reframing as control tends to be broad, global, and aimed at your identity rather than your specific action. The third shift: when reframing fails, they recruit an audience. This is one of the more sophisticated pivots, and it often catches people completely off guard because it doesn't happen directly to your face. It happens behind your back, to mutual friends, to family members, sometimes even to your own children, framed carefully to make the controlling person look reasonable, and you look unreasonable, difficult, or even cruel. The goal here isn't actually to win those third parties over for its own sake. It's to create enough external social pressure that you feel compelled to abandon the boundary just to restore your reputation, or to stop the discomfort of other people questioning you. This tactic reveals something important about how control actually works. It rarely depends entirely on a one-on-one dynamic. It often depends on leveraging the wider social fabric around you, recruiting other people's opinions as a proxy weapon when direct pressure alone isn't sufficient. Recognizing this pivot means understanding that a sudden change in how mutual friends or family members are treating you, right after you set a boundary, is rarely a coincidence. It's often the visible result of a narrative campaign happening entirely out of your view. The fourth shift, when the social pressure campaign doesn't fully work either, they escalate to sudden, dramatic vulnerability. This is one of the more emotionally sophisticated pivots, and it's often deployed by people who are, on some level, genuinely skilled at reading what will actually move you, specifically because they've had a lot of practice doing exactly that throughout the relationship. Suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, there's a crisis, a health scare, real or exaggerated, a sudden confession of past pain, a breakdown that seems to demand your immediate compassion and presence, arriving with suspicious timing right after you've held firm on something that mattered. I want to be careful here, because I'm not suggesting every vulnerable moment from every person is manipulative. Genuine crises happen, and compassion is a real and important part of any relationship. What separates this specific pivot from genuine vulnerability is the timing and the function. It arrives specifically when other control tactics have failed, and it specifically requires you to drop the boundary you just set in order to attend to it. Genuine vulnerability doesn't usually come with an implicit price tag attached. This kind does. The fifth shift, and one of the most important to recognize, when nothing else works, they escalate to punishing withdrawal. The classic silent treatment, sudden coldness, a complete removal of the warmth, attention, or affection you're used to receiving. This tactic works on the same principle as everything else on this list. It's not actually about needing space or being genuinely too hurt to communicate. It's a calculated removal of something valuable to you, specifically timed to create enough discomfort that you'll reach out, apologize, or abandon the boundary just to restore the warmth that's been withdrawn. The tell here again is specificity of timing. Genuine need for space tends to come with at least some acknowledgement, some indication of when or how reconnection might happen. Punishing withdrawal tends to arrive with total silence, no explanation, and an unmistakable sense that the door will only reopen once you've done whatever it takes to earn your way back in Shao, which is precisely the mechanism that makes it control, rather than genuine emotional processing. Here's what ties all 5 of these shifts together, and it's the single most important insight in this entire episode. Every one of these pivots is actually evidence that your boundary is working, not evidence that you did something wrong. This reframe changes everything about how these tactics land once you understand it. The guilt, the character attacks, the recruited audience, the sudden vulnerability, the punishing silence. None of these would be necessary if your original boundary hadn't actually threatened their access to control. A person who genuinely doesn't care about controlling you simply accepts your boundary and moves on. The intensity and creativity of these pivots is directly, reliably proportional to how much that person had come to depend on the specific thing your boundary just took away. This is why, counterintuitively, the moment right after you hold a boundary is so often the hardest, most intense moment of the entire process, rather than the calmest. People expect that setting a healthy boundary should immediately produce relief, and when instead it produces an escalating cascade of guilt, reframing, social pressure, sudden vulnerability, or withdrawal, they often conclude they've made things worse, or that the boundary itself was wrong. It's neither. It's simply what happens, almost mechanically, when a lever that used to work stops working, and the system built around that lever scrambles through its remaining options, one after another, looking for whatever might reopen it. And this is exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. How to actually stay steady through all 5 of these pivots without getting pulled back in by any of them, what it looks like when someone runs out of tactics entirely, and why the person who successfully weathers this entire cascade almost always comes out the other side fundamentally different. Not just from the relationship they just protected themselves from, but from how they handle every relationship in their life going forward. Let's talk about how to actually stay steady through all 5 of these pivots, because recognizing them intellectually is only half the work. The other half is surviving the actual discomfort of watching them unfold in real time without your nervous system convincing you in the moment that the boundary was a mistake. The first tool, and honestly the most important one, is naming the pivot the instant you notice it. This sounds almost too simple, but it's remarkably effective because manipulation tactics rely heavily on operating below conscious recognition. They work best when they feel like organic, unplanned reactions rather than a predictable strategy. The moment you internally say to yourself, "This is the guilt phase," or "This is the reframing me as the problem phase," something shifts in how much power the tactic has over you. You're no longer inside the emotional experience being manipulated by it. You're standing slightly outside it, watching a familiar pattern unfold exactly the way it always has. This small act of naming creates just enough distance for you to respond deliberately, rather than react automatically. The second tool is separating the emotion in the moment from the decision you're being pressured to make. This distinction matters enormously because these tactics are specifically designed to make you feel something intensely enough that acting on that feeling seems urgent and necessary. You can feel guilty and still not reverse your boundary. You can feel genuinely moved by someone's sudden vulnerability and still recognize that the timing makes it unsafe to act on that feeling immediately. You can feel the sting of being called too sensitive and still trust your own read of what actually happened. Learning to let a feeling exist without automatically converting it into an action is one of the most protective skills a person can build, especially against tactics that specifically depend on emotional urgency overriding careful thought. The third tool is expecting the cascade rather than being surprised by it. This is why we walked through all 5 pivots in the first half of this episode in the specific order they tend to occur, because knowing what's coming next removes an enormous amount of its power. If you already expect that guilt might be followed by character attacks, which might be followed by a sudden social pressure campaign, none of it arrives as a shock. It arrives as confirmation of something you already understood was likely to happen. Surprise is what makes people vulnerable to reversing course. Expectation, even of something unpleasant, tends to produce steadiness instead. The fourth tool, and one of the harder ones to practice consistently, resisting the urge to explain your boundary further every time a new tactic appears. This is a genuinely difficult instinct to override because it feels in the moment like more explanation should surely resolve the escalating conflict. But here's what actually tends to happen instead. Each new explanation you offer becomes new material for the next pivot to work with. Explain your reasoning in detail, and that detail becomes something to pick apart, reframe, or use as ammunition in the character attack phase. The boundary itself rarely needs additional justification beyond what you've already said once, clearly. Repeating and elaborating on it again and again in response to each new pressure tactic often does far more to keep you entangled than it does to actually resolve anything. Now let's talk about what happens when someone genuinely runs out of tactics. Because this does happen, and it's worth understanding what it actually looks like, since it can be almost as disorienting as the escalation itself. When all 5 levers have been tried and none of them have worked, when the guilt didn't move you, the character attacks didn't shake your sense of self, the recruited audience didn't successfully turn enough people against you, the sudden vulnerability didn't override your judgment, and the punishing silence didn't bring you crawling back, something has to give. And what typically happens next falls into one of 2 categories. And I want to be honest about both of them, rather than pretending there's only one satisfying outcome available. The first category is quiet capitulation. Not a dramatic apology, not a sudden transformation into a healthier person, but a simple, practical acceptance that this particular avenue of control no longer works, accompanied by a shift toward whatever remaining form of interaction still functions within the new limits you've established. This isn't usually accompanied by insight or growth. It's simply behavioral adjustment, the same way water finds a different path once one channel gets blocked. Relationships can continue this way, sometimes for years, existing within the smaller, boundaried space that's left once the control tactics genuinely stop working without ever requiring the controlling person to actually understand or acknowledge what happened. The second category is disengagement. The person, having exhausted their usual toolkit and found none of it effective, simply reduces their investment in the relationship significantly, sometimes withdrawing from it almost entirely. This can feel, in the short term, like loss, even if the relationship itself was unhealthy, because there's often still real attachment underneath the frustration of no longer being able to control someone. But this disengagement, when it happens, is usually a mercy in disguise, because it removes you from an ongoing cycle of escalating tactics, replacing it with simple, if sometimes cold, distance, which is almost always easier to build a stable life around than an active, continuing campaign to regain control. Either way, here's the thing worth understanding clearly. Neither outcome requires you to feel guilty, responsible, or uncertain about the boundary that produced it. Both outcomes are simply the natural, mechanical result of a control-seeking system finally encountering a wall it cannot get past, regardless of which specific tool it tries. I want to say something important about what happens to you, internally, after successfully weathering this entire cascade, because it changes something much larger than just this one relationship. Once you've recognized guilt as a tactic instead of deserved remorse, recognized character attacks as reframing instead of accurate feedback, recognized recruited audiences as strategy instead of genuine consensus, recognized suspiciously timed vulnerability as leverage instead of pure need, and recognized punishing silence as control instead of authentic processing. You carry that recognition into every future relationship, automatically, almost involuntarily. You become someone who can spot these patterns quickly in new contexts, with new people, long before they've had the chance to fully establish themselves the way they did in whatever relationship taught you to recognize them in the first place. This is, in many ways, the real prize hidden inside this entire painful process. Not just the boundary you held with one specific person, a permanently upgraded ability to distinguish real accountability from strategic manipulation, real vulnerability from timed leverage, real space from punishing silence, in every relationship you'll ever have again for the rest of your life. I want to leave you with an image, because I think it captures everything we've walked through today. Picture water flowing downhill toward a low point it's used to reaching easily, following the same familiar channel it's carved for itself over years of unimpeded flow. Then one day, that channel gets blocked. A boundary, finally, firmly placed exactly where the water used to pass through without any resistance at all. Water, being water, doesn't simply stop and accept the new obstacle. It presses against it. It searches, almost mechanically, for any small gap, any weakness, any place where the old path might still be accessible despite the blockage. It tries the left side, then the right, then presses harder directly against the center, testing every possible angle with the same relentless, patient pressure it's always used to reaching wherever it wants to go. But if the blockage holds, genuinely, consistently, without any small gaps opening under sustained pressure, something eventually has to happen. The water either finds an entirely different, lower path around the obstacle, continuing on its way through new terrain, quietly reduced from what it once could reach, or it simply pools, slows, and eventually stops pressing at all, settling into whatever new shape the landscape now allows it to take. Either way, here's what matters most. The blockage was never responsible for whatever happens to the water afterward. It simply held exactly where it needed to hold, regardless of how many different angles the water tried, regardless of how long or how forcefully it pressed against something that wasn't moving. And once you've been the barrier that held, once you've watched every possible pressure tactic exhaust itself against something in you that simply would not give way, you carry an entirely different relationship with your own boundaries into everything that comes after. You stop wondering if you're strong enough to hold the line the next time water comes rushing toward you, looking for whatever gap it can find. You already know. You've already held. And water, however persistent, however creative in its search for a way through, was never actually stronger than stone that had finally fully decided not to move.